morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to our expert panel, Navigating GenAI Minefields, Safeguarding Data Privacy and Strengthening Governance, brought to you by our friends at Daugherty Business Solutions. I'm Brian Mink, co-founder and president of Data Science Connect, the world's largest data and AI community. Today, we're excited to welcome hundreds of attendees from all over the world to discuss data privacy, ethics, and governance in the age of GenAI. GenAI has ushered in an era of unprecedented opportunities for innovation, but it has also raised critical data privacy, security, ethics, and governance considerations. As we navigate exciting new opportunities created by GenAI, we're faced with the challenge of striking a delicate balance between fostering innovation and upholding responsibility in data privacy and governance. Today, we'll discuss these complexities in detail with our panel, exploring how organizations can foster responsible innovation. We're honored to hear from a distinguished panel of experts today. Nathan Orwig, VP of Innovation and Strategy at Daugherty Business Solutions. Anshul Jain, Head of Data Science Safety at Meta. Gil Geresti, VP of Data Products, Governance, and Ops in the Chief Data Office at ADP. Supriya, Vice President and Head of Data Science and Advanced Analytics at BBDO. And Donald Spaulding, Director of Technology Innovation at Verizon. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. To make this feel a little more in person, we suggest you add a photo to your profile and include your bio, LinkedIn profile, and other information you'd want your fellow attendees to see. Next, please take advantage of the Q&A and chat features throughout the talks. We're dedicating a portion of the end to Q&A, so be sure to upvote the questions you'd like the panel to address. If you're wondering where your organization stands compared to others on your AI journey, check out the poll questions in the right sidebar. And finally, to learn more about how to balance privacy and governance in the age of GenAI, check out the call to action below throughout the webinar from our sponsor, Daugherty Business Solutions. Now, without further ado, let's kick off our panel. So welcome, everyone. We'll start off with some introductions. If each of you could tell us a bit about your background and current role, and we can keep these to about 30 seconds so we have ample time for the discussion. So I'll just start with you in the order that you appear on my screen. So Nathan, why don't you kick us off?
Hi guys, Nathan Orwig. I lead innovation and strategy for Daugherty Business Solutions, among a few other things. I lead our AI practice, healthcare, and contact center. Daugherty is a kind of boutique consulting firm, about 2,500 people, but we're very special forces oriented. We focus heavily on certain areas such as AI. We've been working with 100 of the Fortune 500 over the last 35 years. In particular, I have been actively engaged in multiple AI and GenAI initiatives over the last 16 to 18 months.
Thanks, Nathan. Anshul?
Cool. My name is Anshul. I lead the data science for safety, privacy, and compliance across the messaging network that we have at Meta, or Facebook network and Instagram network. I've been doing this for the last 8 years at Meta, and then before that I was at eBay. But yes, I think as the safety landscape and the privacy landscape has been changing, there are a lot of recent developments that have happened. So I'm very excited to speak about those today with you all.
Great. Welcome, Anshul. Gil?
Everyone, I'm excited to be here. I'm Gil. I'm the VP of Data Products and Data and AI Governance at ADP. I've been at ADP for about 4.5 years and really been very active in making our AI journey more robust, more secure, and better governed to ensure we responsibly use AI across the board. Prior to that, I spent 10 years in military and government, and I've been in both startups and large companies, switching between operations and product roles along the way. And excited to be working in this realm of AI and having this conversation with you all.
Thanks, Gil. Welcome. Supriya?
Thanks, Brian. My name is Supriya, and I'm thrilled to be here today as part of this panel discussion. I currently serve as VP of Marketing Sciences at BBDO, which is a media and advertising company based out of Atlanta, where I oversee a range of initiatives focused on delivering insights from data using advanced data analytics and machine learning. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Supriya. Donald?
Yeah, good afternoon. Happy to be part of the conversation today. Look forward to hearing from my colleagues and some of the things they're doing. I work in the Verizon Business Innovation Group, And our role here in this particular group is really to work with large enterprise businesses to help them address specific types of business issues, business challenges that they're having. And so we do a lot of work in the AI space. So I'm really interested to hear basically how do we reconcile a lot of the things that these other organizations I'm on here with today, the drive to innovate and to do more with all of the things that we have around compliance, governance, and the things that we're trying to do to keep people safe. So eager to dive into the conversation.
Yeah, thank you all for the great introductions. So we'll kick things off by talking about some of the most pressing ethical challenges that are posed by GenAI. So obviously this is a rapidly evolving area. And every day we're seeing more and more situations where there are potential ethical issues such as misuse of generated content or privacy breaches. So if you all could speak to some of what you're seeing in terms of what are some of the major challenges that you see popping up or potentially popping up in the future. Why don't we start in reverse order of how we did intros and kick things off with you, Donald?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a few things at hand. I think really kind of right off what comes to mind is a lot of the misuse of content, and whether that's using things that are generated and synthesized in a way where you're working in spaces that I work in a lot with finance companies around fraud. So there's a big risk there in terms of synthetic fraud and some of the things that we're seeing that are evolving there that really are being enabled by some of the technologies we're going to talk about today. I think also in that same category, there's definitely protections that are considerations around copyrights, intellectual property, creative properties. So I think when some of the capabilities are misapplied to infringe on some of those rights, I definitely see those that are concerning. The other thing too is that I see that as we begin to rely more and more on large data sources and pools to basically be able to drive some of the capabilities, your risk of breaches, more data, more risk of breaches, more concerns around how do you protect data. I know organizations, really, I think work very hard to not only protect the data, but also today it seems that breaches are more common than we'd like. So how do you deal with, something when there is a breach? What's the level of transparency? How are you, how you're really, being able to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward, again, to communicate, to help protect, and in those instances where there are problems, to mitigate whatever damage is done. And then the other thing that kind of comes to mind, and I work a lot with like our Verizon data in terms of the applications that we have, again, largely in the area of basically how do we better detect and mitigate fraud. And I think that when you're looking at data, I think it's really important to make note of like, are there biases in the data? And are those biases going to get amplified in some of the applications and some of the different types of use cases that some of these technologies and platforms support? The greater the risk of the decision and the outcome of whatever the use case or the application is, the greater biases can actually play a significant role in undesirable outcomes. So I think as we look across just what I see as maybe some of the ethics behind how do we really navigate all this, those are the things that jump out to me the most.
Yeah, some really great points in there. Supriya, what are you seeing?
I 100% resonate with what is shared here by Donald. And then I would like to add few more things here on the list. Of course, there are several. And as we are evolving, it's a dynamic environment. And every day we come up, we hear news about how things are getting a little more fishy with GenAI. So first, let's understand by example how GenAI is generating the results and outcome. And in AI, we send some example data so that the code can learn how to read or and cull out the insights from it. And we call it a training data. Now, in the tool like ChatGPT, which is used at scale, this training data is collected either through users' input in form of a data or a query, or the tool is scraping the data from the web. So understand that what goes in is never coming out, at least in the current scenario. And we have seen several examples last mid of last year, a major consumer electronic company, which was also in news. Two of its employees accidentally leaked sensitive data via Chat GPT that could now possibly be part of Chat GPT's training data. Many vendors, including OpenAI, are cracking down on how user inputs are incorporated into future training, but there's still no guarantee that sensitive data will remain secure and outside of future training sets. So that comes to my mind in terms of how this unauthorized incorporation of user data can be challenging. Another thing that Donald covered is bias and fairness, where again taking example of facial recognition system that struggle with accuracy when identifying women or people of color. This happened because the data sets used for training was not diverse enough, and it led to biased outcome. And in one instance, AI recruiting tool developed by major tech company was found to be biased against female applicants because it was trained on resumes submitted predominantly by men. And third is I would like to bring in is limited regulatory safeguards. Some countries and regulatory bodies are working towards it and safeguarding the data, but no overarching standards are officially in place to hold AI vendors accountable for what they have built and how they use how the artificial intelligence tools are used. So, and the proposed regulation closest to becoming law is EU AI Act, and it is expected to be published in the official journal of European Union in this summer. Um, but some aspects of the law will take as long as 3 years to become enforceable. So these are my top of the list in terms of the challenges.
Brian,
Yeah.
could I just add a comment to
Absolutely.
previous? So in regards to healthcare data, we're seeing the same thing. One of our healthcare clients trained its AI on its own data set, which included its suite of population. And by default, it by accident started to recommend lower quality care to people lower down on the socioeconomic curve. And the reason it did that is because it was training against Medicaid patients that typically have less income and therefore get prescribed to local doctors that don't provide as good a care. And so the big dilemma is, do we train the model to make money in healthcare, or do you train the model to give equitable distribution of care? And it's a really big deal. And even yesterday with bias, as everyone is probably aware on this call, one of the news channels picked up on Alexa gave a biased response to one of the political candidates. Doesn't matter which side you're on. It was very, very obvious. One of the candidates, Alexa said, I can't endorse candidate one way or the other. And on the other one, it gave kind of a 1 to 2 minute overview of that candidate. Now, it's since been pulled since yesterday because it made all the top news channels. But that bias is a really big issue, and trying to fight it with the appropriate levels of data, and then tune and maintain your model over time such that the model doesn't drift back into a biased state is something that we're focusing on. Sorry to interrupt. That was great comments, though.
Yeah, great points. Anshul or Gil, what do you guys think are some of the most pressing challenges you're seeing?
I think all of that makes sense. I think pretty much the pressing challenges they pretty much ended up sharing. I think around like bias, like privacy itself. I think those are the biggest ones. Like for example, even for me, like when I'm seeing content generated and coming from Gen AIs and like from llamas itself, I think the biggest question is how is my content being used, and what are the other reasons for which it's being used. I think the other thing is that you keep seeing like these data leaks, for example, like from different companies itself, and then the question comes is like, okay, how strong their data security systems are. Like, what if like the content ends up leaking, and what if it's being used for different reasons? I think we have all seen like impersonation happening just based on few data assets that we have out there on the social media itself and like other channels. But the question is like, how can we make sure like some of our data is contained and has highly secure? And again, this I think ethical question of the data always remains like whose data it is, like it is ours or it is with the company where we have these footprints. So I think like some of those ethical challenges continue to remain, but of course, like as we are making progress in this overall space, the new space that we can think of, hopefully there will be more regulations and governance coming in. But yeah, we can get to those topics later.
Yeah, I will just to wrap up. I think there's like a lot of very good points here. I think the key things we have to think about is at the end of the day, these models, as my esteemed colleagues here in the have mentioned, are only as good as the data they're trained on, and even if it's a very large sample, they can represent existing bias in the sample. And our world is not, we have biases in our world, right? The question, how do we responsibly use these models and responsibly build on top of them where we do not amplify the existing ethical issues in the world today, right? We have real life issues with pay disparities, with compensation benchmarking tools can, if not controlled for it, could present problems. As Supriya mentioned, there have been issues with candidate screenings. Just because successful candidates historically have been of a certain type, that doesn't mean that those should be the ones in the future. So controlling for the existing biases in our samples is a key point to have, and we all have to address to make sure that we ethically use, don't create more disparity by these systems.
I just add to that too that I mean sometimes the bias isn't as obvious. So for example, at one point in time, those who could read and write had distinct advantages over those who could not in our very culture we live in today. And I think access is another form of bias that I think is important to consider too. So in terms of equity and how we use these capabilities to service people, I know that our line of business, being a carrier and a network provider, we often think about who has access and who can benefit as a form of bias when those who cannot do that aren't really able to really reap the rewards. So I also really kind of urge people to think about making sure we're representative of all people when we're harnessing some of these capabilities.
Yeah, great points all around. And I think it tees up nicely our next question, which is, we've talked about all these ethical challenges and potential privacy concerns and various other concerns related to GenAI, a very powerful technology. But how can organizations effectively leverage this technology to do good and to improve their businesses while also ensuring that there are robust controls and governance around ethics and privacy? How do you balance those at times competing goals? Who wants to kick us off there?
I can speak, right? I think where this is going is pretty much when we know there are safety and privacy concerns, how are organizations making sure that safety and privacy is it start including at the design level itself. And these are not the questions and aftermath that we are thinking after building products and after they are being adopted versus they are being having principles and practices when we say that privacy by design itself. So the questions that the team should be asking and the frameworks that they should be establishing is like, how can we make sure that do we need this data? How can we have like data minimization in place? And at the same time, when something is being reviewed or the new product is being built about or thought about, are we following the right standard practices from a privacy perspective? Are we making sure that the information that we're sharing with the user, how transparent are we on that information itself? So similarly, like there are other areas that someone can think of, like from encryption, from access perspective in general, from data retention. If you have used that information from the user to train a certain model or come up with a certain feature set itself, like do you still need that data in the system, and how you're communicating back to the user from a transparency perspective. So I think there are like list of things that you can pretty much do from a design perspective in your organization, and those should be from day zero.
Yep.
Yeah,
Brian, I
I
might
would
add
say,
on that. There are quite a few AI, I'll just call it ethical frameworks. So there's IEEE, there's SLMR, AI for people. I mean, there's a bunch. But in looking across those, because we have to consider those with our clients, there are some kind of shared attributes across all of those frameworks. And I think implementing a governing board that then implements a framework is very important. So one of those being kind of like the human right, human agency perspective. Almost all of those frameworks focus on that piece. All of them focus on accountability, transparency, fairness, which is bias, obviously. And then they kind of vary from there on out. There's kind of these ideas around shared prosperity. So is it okay to build something that destroys jobs, for example? Right. So we're forced to focus on that dilemma all the time. At my particular company, we worked with a crop yield company to implement an AI that can recognize crops to the level of about 95% as accurate as a botanist. Okay, so is that product going to put all the botanists out of job? Not necessarily. I think what those governing boards would start to consider is what is the human impact on this? What is the reskilling that is required? And then what might be the new kind of role, job feature? Maybe there's a higher value task available versus the kind of routine identification of just that plant. The other thing we didn't hit on in some of the risks are the liability. So the liability in certain areas such as firefighting and so on. So if you load up building schematics, blueprints, and then you load up the type of fire, you can use GenAI to help the firefighters navigate where they're supposed to go and when. However, if you get it wrong, who's liable? So I think and people die, right? So different types of fires work differently, oil, gas, and whatnot. And firefighters in my town. So I'm using a background of Charleston to demonstrate impersonation of AI. But a bunch of guys died a couple of years back. Eight guys in a warehouse fire with mattresses because they didn't know those mattresses were in that facility. So again, if AI were building them a routine to get through that building faster and destroy the fire, who is liable if it's wrong? I think those governing boards need to consider things of that nature as well.
I think I'd say that if we think about this in the context of ethics and privacy, I would split it into three main areas. I would say transparency, robust policies, and implementation of tools are the three areas I would touch on. So one, I think it's extremely important for transparency to be, and it is transparency is both very important and set in regulations in certain locations. Where individuals that we engage with and we like put an AI tool in front of, whether their data is being used with AI or if they are actually engaging with an AI like application, need to be aware, there needs to be an informed consent in a way that they are engaging with an AI tool, and kind of anything that they're sharing will be shared, essentially is being put into AI. So that's number one. Second piece is kind of a robust set of policies and standards that a company has to develop, organization has to develop, is how do we handle data behind the scenes when it's not an individual using or interacting with an AI platform directly. Like what would we put into an AI tool and what would we not? Where are the rules and what is our commitment to our clients or to the people we engage with? And that needs to be very clear to anyone within the company that has the ability to access AI tools. So they are aware and are kind of following this set of guidelines and rules and understanding why it's very important as well. And then the third layer is tools. So after we have policies in place, building in the guardrail tools to actually kind of ensure compliance with policies and regulations, and building out GenAI firewalls that will kind of maintain that PII is not being sent to the model, or other tools such as that are important as another layer of control to ensure that even with the best policies in place and transparency, things that should not be sent or used with AI will be filtered out and controlled. I think a combination of these three layers is a very important way to a very important combination to allow for that measures of control and privacy and ethics while enabling like the continued innovation as we embark on it as well.
I think most of the great points are already covered, but I would like to add, and I totally agree with all the great lists that our panelists have shared as to what are some of those measures that we can take. I agree with you, Gil. Develop and like communicating clearly on data collection process, how it is used, how it is stored, and how it will be shared is really crucial. And here, over communication is okay. I think over communicating that how this things and repeatedly is totally fine. I think everyone should know, including stakeholders and the customers and the users. Another thing that I really liked, Anshul picked up was on in terms of minimum data collection. So, but for that, we do need like a robust infrastructure in terms of that how we can do more of a federated learning where we are transferring raw data to decentralized devices rather than coming and coming into a one central server. So that's where we can reduce PII information, reduce collection of data. In fact, it will also reduce the cost for the organization because it doesn't have to take on the cost of collecting and maintaining that data. So totally agree with all my co-panelists. Back to you, Brian.
Yeah, great points all around. And leading into that, Supriya, I think thinking about governance, so we've talked about a lot of the challenges, talked about some of the ethical framework, some of the considerations that you can sort of put into place, whether it's councils within your organization to sort of advise on some of these tricky issues. But how does this impact the way that we govern data? What sort of data governance frameworks we have in place? What are sort of automated frameworks? What are things that require more human intervention? So who wants to take that one for starters, and what types of governance mechanisms you can put in place to make sure that we are deploying GenAI responsibly within organizations?
I think some of the things we've talked about in terms of like creating boards, frameworks, things of that sort. But the one thing that maybe we haven't touched a lot on is just the monitoring aspect of, as we create these frameworks and we really try to articulate principles and guidelines in terms of how we want all this to unfold. I think it's really important to be able to like look at safe acclimation from idea to adoption, the practical points in between. So how you create feedback loops as you go through and you gradually begin, to test and begin to look at widening the audiences that you're affecting. I guess the critical nature of the types of use cases that are actually, really, being addressed. I just think it's really important that you not only as you're acclimating to something new, a new application you may be launching, but actually as on an ongoing basis, be able to create regular checks. And I know there's a lot of great tools out there to do that, but I think some of that just has to do with your practices, as an organization or institution.
Yeah, I will second that. I'll start with many of these challenges are not new, right? AI is not new. It's been around for a while. It's just been amplified and accelerated with the emergence of generative AI, and AI becoming a household term and everyone engaging more so than before with AI applications. At ADP, for example, we've had AI capabilities and AI tools as part of our products for years. And ADP established about roughly 6 years ago, I believe, our Data and AI Ethics Council, right? That is responsible for governing and kind of improving the ethical use of AI, data and AI across the company, across everything that we do. I would say that the emergence of generative AI about 2 years ago in this current generation, right, it really accelerated everything. Required some operational changes in how that works, and kind of forced kind of a rethink of what does that look like. And we've created, and I believe it's extremely important to create a governing body across the compliance teams. We're talking privacy, we're talking legal focus on ethics, we're talking about security, and kind of quarterbacked by our chief data office to ensure that we properly address and review all of the use cases to come by, that we can continue to innovate and continue to think and work kind of forward looking, but continuously do this responsibly. We've built that robust process where everyone can come up with a use case, but they need a stamp of approval from this group to be able to engage in exploring it and researching. I would say further that in order to alleviate some of the risks, there's a capability or kind of the need to establish more secure playgrounds, right? An area where teams or individuals can go and play, quote unquote, right? But with all of the guardrails in place, with no real individual data, and kind of being able to experiment and develop before it's being used with real life data and or with the risk of actual data being shared with models. And then after that matures and goes through those additional approvals, to ensure still after that experimentation that we're kind of in a good posture in terms of privacy, ethics, and security, ensuring we still have those technical guardrails in place that we've touched on before, because there's still human interaction with these models and capabilities. So we need to continuously ensure that nothing breaks in that sense. So it's a layered human and machine, I would say, driven governance to ensure one that we're even trying to do the right things and not trying to do things that could put us at risk or put individuals' data at risk, and then having actual technical capabilities in place to ensure adherence, I would say, downstream.
And I would like to add that in terms of mechanism, I feel that having a AI code of conduct, and specifically for AI development and deployment, and making sure that that code of conduct is also integrated into the life cycle, which ensures that we are considering ethical questions at every stage of AI lifecycle, from data collection to model training to deployment and monitoring. So I think having that in addition to what Gil and Donald anyways have covered, I feel that that should be as part of the framework. Another thing is, and I know Donald has already covered, and Gil, you also touched upon, is implementing the tools. Having systems in place which can detect anomalies and identify potential misuse or unintended outcomes. So, and this is not like a one-time exercise, it's a continuous evaluation where we are trying to look at effectiveness, looking at fairness and accuracy of our models. So these are two, and of course, I would like to add one more, is making our users, who are probably the employers, more like a data steward, who are responsible for taking AI, or I'll say take action for responsible AI use. So it should be done and everyone should have the trainings and I know people will hate me, but there should be, trainings which should be repeatedly done, maybe on, employees' birthdays. So this is something that I would like to add in terms of implementing governance in the organization.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I think, Brian, what we're seeing across many different industries is that virtually every company embarking upon the journey towards AI is standing up some sort of data science and automation function, right? Inside that function, you typically have a governance. And I think, to everyone's point here, there's multiple frameworks, but the idea of having a career atlas, data from engineering, data science, ML ops, all these different groups, super important. And then the step models, how do you execute in this new AI space? Very, very critical. So just blindly going in and go, hey, we're going to stand up ChatGPT and do it for this thing, and with no guardrails, appears to be a bit of a dangerous activity. And it plays out importantly in lines of service or business that do have high risk, so airline, healthcare, and so on. And I think what we're going to see, so our company's been building a whole suite of use cases by industry, so automotive, finance, whatever, but we're also trying to get to the compliance rules and specific AI guardrails by industry, and that doesn't necessarily exist everywhere yet. So in the airline industry, we've been helping several different customers. In one context, we've been trying to help with onboarding and reducing the onboarding time, something we've actually gotten to work pretty well with AI and a product that's going to be released in the near future. But some of the challenge there is if the model drifts, so the more data that we get into the large language model, more data we get, what we're seeing is that the model tends to become less accurate. So that data governance, data science group constantly has to be monitoring the model in order for it to maintain its level of accuracy that they're targeting, which is a 13-minute reduction in onboarding. Now, if they don't get that, that team has particular safeguards and tuning concepts, and they even have advanced warning AI that helps them look and predict if it's going to get out of alignment. But I think that monitoring function is super important. Also, then the cost function, we haven't really brought that up, but a lot of these companies charge by transaction, right? So it sounds really cool to do all this AI stuff until we have so many transactions we don't even know what to do with them, and our bill for using said system, skyrockets. So I think that financial responsibility and understanding, A, how is this going to be used from a cost perspective, and then B, how are we going to keep it true and aligned, then C, keep it ethical. All these things have to play a role, and those new data science AI competencies are usually the place that governing type of situation is living. Some companies, it's disparate all over the place, but what we're seeing is those that are really moving the needle do have some sort of competency they've stood up with a governing entity inside of it.
Yeah, and those are all great points. And I think, Nathan, to your point there at the end, it's just really not going into this blind as to the costs and the risks. Very critical, and to have a framework where you're thinking through these issues and you have a process for handling them as they arise and hopefully anticipating them as much as possible, which leads nicely into our next question, which is how you can mitigate the risks associated with GenAI. And there's been some folks in the chat talking about this, synthetic data, to what extent can you leverage synthetic data when using real world data is perhaps problematic for various reasons. To what extent can you sanitize data once it's been used and no longer needed? How do you destroy that data so it can't be retrieved anymore? So what are some of the best practices that you guys are seeing in terms of risk mitigation strategies around leveraging AI and also ensuring that there's appropriate governance around the data that is being used to train these models?
I think one thing that comes obviously to my mind and something that we use is pretty much making sure that we're practicing exclusion and anonymity, like pretty much what you spoke about sanitization itself, but really making sure that we are taking steps to exclude pretty much the personal information from the data that we are using, like for example, names, date of births itself, and also really not trying to use the data sources where we have bunch of personal information. And in cases we have to do that, you have to be very transparent with the user if this is the data that's being collected, in what way this will be actually used, and what's the data retention policy for those things, and like explicitly take a consent from a user. But yeah, I do really value like data exclusion and anonymity primarily, as one of the guiding principles.
Yeah, and I believe in prevention is better than cure. So from the start itself, I think invest in secure infrastructure and tools, including advanced firewalls, detection systems, security information, event management tools to secure GenAI systems from cyber threats and data breaches. Also, like we have covered this as part of our earlier question, that implement continuous monitoring and improvement. So use continuous improvement approach to refine and enhance technologies, and it's a progressive path. Incorporate feedback from audits, assessments, stakeholders, and use users to make necessary adjustments and enhancements. And if something really goes wrong, then have a clear mechanism for users and stakeholders to seek redress, like ensuring mechanisms that are accessible, transparent, effective in resolving disputes or addressing any kind of harm that has been done.
I'd say that the starting point for much of it is tiering of risk, right? I think risk tiering is essential as we think about mitigating the risk associated with different use cases. And for each use case that we put forward and we think about, a first step is to really understand what risk does it pose. What is the end all be all? What is the data it will need to access? What kind of interactions does it pose in the ADP context? Like, is it customer facing? Will a customer directly engage with a model or AI here? What data is being used? Is there sensitive information required as part of this process? And by tiering the risk, we can then implement or decide what are the level of controls that need to be in place moving forward. And that risk tiering exercise is something is an ever evolving exercise, I would say, as we learn and know more about the risk that is posed and the new models coming out and new applications that we're developing. Once we have that in place, we can decide for different risk levels, like, are policies sufficient? Are technical guardrails or capabilities are required? Can we just allow for experimentation in a playground, like I've mentioned before? But it starts with an understanding for each use case, like what risk does it actually pose? There are very low there are very low risk use cases, so let's go, right? But if it's sensitive, it can have adverse effects. What can we what can we do to ensure that we mitigate, and then all these tools come into play?
Yeah, I would add to that in terms of going about that assessment and the tiering, that it's really important to get multiple perspectives on what the actual risk is. And what I mean by that is that you want perspective of the legal people, you want perspective of people who are charged and responsible for protecting the data and understanding how to really mitigate any risks there. You want folks who are on the business side who understand what is the opportunity at hand. You want folks from marketing who understand from a privacy perspective what are some of the perceptions and the things that your customer base is really going to be thinking. So I found that you land on the best assessment of risk when you enter a lot of folks. And I know that in all of our businesses we sometimes have to go at some things solo on making decisions, but the more you can pull in other perspective, I think the better you're really going to be able to articulate what the real risk for any of these use cases might be.
Donald, we discovered something very interesting at a fast serve restaurant chain. These have 3 or 4 different restaurant brands, but we helped them stand up a data science, security, and governance approach, right? It had all their policies around analytics and security and products. And at first it was kind of not as effective, because the data governance group had this tendency to try to explain or get the executives to learn the sub details of every single kind of policy or compliance law. So they spent so much time kind of explaining the underpinnings of the governance process and the details around it, that they weren't able to get to decisions quickly enough. So what we kind of help them pivot on was getting the governance team to become the experts in their data domains or compliance or rules or HIPAA or whatever the thing is, and then really serving the decisions to the executive leaders in a way that they can understand, such that they can make decisions about large data issues quickly. Right. And so it was kind of a pivot, and that model seemed to work. So it was basically let the experts be the experts and serve up the decisions to the people that would ultimately own them. And that seemed to be effective at that particular location. One of the other things we're seeing also is that kind of a containment of data, that training on public LLMs can actually expose intellectual property. And for pharma clients who are all kind of battling right now to figure out how do they do discovery with AI across all sorts of products and ecosystems and genetic types and backgrounds and all this sort of thing, they don't want to give away their IP that they're building, but at the same time, they want to train their models. So that point about synthetic data, we're seeing quite a few customers try to take an existing data set or something close enough, bring it in-house, and then generate a whole bunch of their own internal data by scraping documents or kind of replicating things. And that, at least in that regard, doesn't expose their intellectual property by kind of using the internet to train a model. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. And there's a good question in the chat. And I think this is from John. Does the panel believe more companies would allow open LLM use if they could assure data privacy and guardrails? And I'm going to weave that into our next question, which is kind of asking you guys to make a prediction about what the future is going to look like. And my question to you is, do you think as companies start to work through these issues, start to have a better understanding of some of the privacy, the ethics, the governance concerns around GenAI, and start to evolve their practices and become more mature in that regard, do you think that will create more GenAI use cases, business cases to use this technology? Do you think companies will become maybe even more cautious about using it as they start to flesh out some of these issues and start to really get their arms around potential risks? Where do you see this going over the next few years as more organizations start to implement some of the risk management strategies that you guys have so well articulated today?
Yeah, I don't think there's reining this back, right? It's out of the bag. Like, we won't dial back this. This will continue to grow, but and capabilities will continue to increase. New features will come out, but we all have the responsibility of being very mindful of what these tools can actually do. What should we use them for? And just as importantly, what should we not use them for? Right? What do they do well and what do they do poorly? And there's a level of literacy that we all have to get to. Like, literally everyone in the workforce have to get to a certain level of literacy of what should we or should we not use this for. And then that will lead to the right level of mindfulness and the ability to do that risk versus benefit assessment all the time as tools come up. There are areas in which the cost or risk is low and benefits are high, And I think we've already seen, I can say we've seen it at ADP and others have seen it elsewhere, like that you can get operational benefits and improvement in service organization capabilities and so on and so forth that are pretty low hanging fruit and with limited risk. But once you, but we shouldn't all jump after the most, the new flashy thing. Everything that comes out has a certain level of risk associated to it, and we have to be mindful as we do so. I don't think companies can stick their hands in the sand and just not implement capabilities and try and learn what are the operational benefits they can get. Otherwise, they'll be left behind. But they will have to do that diligently.
I think some of that really is going to correlate directly to what's the level of trust organizations can establish with the byproducts of whatever they're producing. And because, I mean, as long as there's an audience to consume it and the audience feels confident in what they're consuming, then you're going to keep producing more. And that doesn't pertain just to AI, it pertains to most anything. So, you know, I really do think that your ability to, again, make sure you're producing trustworthy outputs and you're able to really assure validation and minimize risk. I think Gil makes a good point. It's out of the bag. I mean, I'm not quite sure what you do to put it back in at this point in time, or whether there is even a reason to put it back in. To be honest, I think, you know, it's there.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think if you ask any of us 30 years ago, those that were in the IT game that long ago, the topics du jour were, you know, CRM, ERP, business intelligence. Now flash forward, everybody and their grandmother knows what ChatGPT is, including my kids and my grandmother, actually. And you've seen data science and intelligent automation drift to a central focus. You've also seen the security and then the risk associated with doing that drift to a central focus. So this week we talked to one of our customers that's in the banking industry, and out of his mouth, CEO, he basically said, we now view every single company we have to deal with as a security risk in the technology space. And anyone that comes in consulting or product, introducing a new LLM or whatever, we are viewing them with a certain amount of risk. And I've never literally heard that comment so strongly made. So I think it goes to the statement that this definitely is coming more in focus, not less. The ideas and the governing rules and the maturity, I think you're going to probably see stricter data laws, more focused industry-specific boards and regulations and compliance. There's also thing we haven't talked about yet. Certain industries need fail-safes, kill switch, and contingency plan. That hasn't even come up, right? So if something goes extremely wrong, what do you do, right? So I think we're at the tip of the iceberg with this, and it's going to change everybody's job. And here it already has, right? Our job's going to be different. You know, if we were digging a ditch with a spoon before, we suddenly got a shovel, and now we got a front end loader. We got this really powerful thing where we can do some stuff. So we're going to have to adapt and learn and change and move on to the higher value tasks. And the companies that don't, I truly think, I mean, if they use data and they're not just, you know, producing some widget that data doesn't care about or they don't care about, every company is going to be affected that does not move forward and kind of adapt to this new paradigm. But that's my 2 cents.
I think all of that makes sense. I think I'll just add the last bit on importance of governance and regulation and compliance in the space. There have been, like, of course, like past directives, for example, European Privacy Directive, also known as GDPR, for example. I think those things came in, which have definitely helped us like sensitize like a lot of PII. But those are like similar set of regulations that we would need in this space as well. I'm sure, like as the industry has evolved over the last 30 years, has Nathan mentioned, we have gotten better at coming up with governance and data governance itself. But I think really making progress on data governance will help us norm on common uh, dimensions in order to make progress in this area, because otherwise it's like completely dependent on the organization on how they want to make decisions, and sometimes that might not be done with the most optimal privacy initiatives. But yes, my focus is on governance pretty much.
So we're just about out of time, but I want to wrap up with our lightning round and go around to each of you and have you share a key insight in one word or a phrase, a key insight or takeaway about balancing Gen AI innovation with privacy, ethics, and governance. So why don't we start with you, Gil?
Sorry, feels like we've been talking about it for an hour. I think it's all about driving innovation and enabling innovation while being responsible and conscious of the risks. And that mindfulness and consciousness is what's extremely important as we move forward, and do that balancing of risk versus reward. How do we enable and put smiles on our clients and their associates' faces while maintaining that their data is secure and is being used responsibly?
Absolutely. Supriya?
I think I'll go with great innovation comes great responsibility. And
Yeah.
for me, responsible AI use means constant vigilance, feedback, and adaptability.
Yep, I thought that same thing too, Supriya. That Spider-Man line, even great power comes great responsibility. But if everyone just saw Oppenheimer, which I think a lot of us did, I mean, we've just been given a very powerful set of weapons that we don't exactly know how they're going to end up, to be honest. And I think you're absolutely right on both points. We have to be very responsible. I kind of had this little phrase I was thinking about. Every time we search and train with an LLM, we can expose. So I think we just have to keep this mindset that we need to mitigate exposure with literally every interaction. So
Absolutely. Anshul?
I think like a slightly different lens to it. Like I think I always use this in my organization. Ownership comes with accountability. So if you're accountable to deliver value, you are also accountable to make sure that people are like these systems are built from a most privacy intensive perspective. So invest in privacy councils, invest in privacy governance on the teams, invest in having external privacy evaluators on your board itself, and do not see that as a function which is limiting your innovation, but more as a function that is working together to build better for our users over a period of time. And that's where you're being accountable. So build an organization where you have the right incentives in place, because if that's not the case, things can fail.
Absolutely. Donald, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, so I think for me, what really I think is a focus is to actually like proceed with intention and mindfulness. And what I mean by that is try really hard to find high impact applications with low risk. And that's kind of easier to say than to do, but learn from those experiences. I mean, like really understand what makes success and why it's successful, and then build on it and gradually forge your way into like grounds that you take on more and more responsibility, and your outcomes are more and more impactful. But learn from easy experiences and go from there.
Yeah, great points, and just really important, I think, to balance. That was the word that I heard several of you use, just maintaining that balance between all of these competing considerations and figuring out how do you get the right people in the room and have these conversations while not limiting innovation, and really moving the needle in meaningful ways, and not overly exposing your organization to risk in the process. So thank you again to all of our panelists for joining us. These were really great insights, and enjoyed the conversation with all of you. If you missed any of the webinar today or you want to rewatch anything, the recording will be available just a few minutes after the webinar if you refresh this page. And want to say a special thank you again to our partner at Daugherty Business Solutions for making this webinar possible. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Good afternoon.